will sort of pseudo ignore that. Ah!
That's actually been happening a lot.
We just wiggle that wire.
Oh,
I'm just gonna not touch it. So I can sort of pseudo get started whenever we want. I'm also happy to wait another couple minutes for people.
I think we can let people come in during the presentation because we want to make sure we get the whole hour for people with questions and everything.
Okay. Shall I just start then?
Yeah, please
All right.
go ahead.
I'm Jeffrey Herron. Nice to meet you all. I'm going to just leap right in because I have a whole bunch of slides to get through. Trying to make this a packed presentation for this group. Quick though, I have some disclosures to make, especially if it's going out on the recording. This is really important stuff. I need to disclose that in the past I was a previous employee of Medtronic while I was working on some of the systems that are discussed here. Also, Medtronic as a company has donated devices and funding to support some of the research, but at a personal level, I don't really have any financial conflicts of interest with Medtronic or really with many people at all. There's some companies I do some consulting with, but they're completely irrelevant to this discussion. But also kind of at a high level, I want to emphasize that a lot of the different technologies we talk about here are not necessarily commercially in use or available. They're investigational, looking forward about future therapeutic devices and opportunities that are not currently approved for clinical use. So with that out of the way, I am Jeffrey Herron. I'm an assistant professor in neurological surgery here at the University of Washington. I'm not a neurosurgeon. I have a PhD in electrical engineering. So I'm an engineer embedded within a neurosurgery department. I've also been in and out of industry, as I just mentioned before. I've worked within a big biomedical device manufacturer company headquartered in Minnesota, Medtronic. And my research focus is on bidirectional neural interfaces, i.e. devices that can do both neural sensing and stimulation of the brain for clinical studies to improve treatment of a variety of different neurological disorders, such as Parkinson's disease, tremor, but also neuropsychiatric applications like obsessive compulsive disorder and bipolar depression. And then I also do some work in trying to improve the rehabilitation of people who have suffered neurological injuries such as stroke. Quick, high level, neural engineering at UW, right? We're an established leader in a lot of this basically work. And at some point, we're the historical site of the first brain-computer interface demonstration by Professor Ed Betts. And there's been a variety of different on-campus institutions that have worked in this neural engineering space that I'm going to be presenting about today, including historically the Center for Neurotechnology, which still exists as a undergraduate research, summer research experience, but used to fund for about 10 years a large amount of on-campus research. Currently, there's also the Weill Neuro Hub, Computational Neuroscience Center, but then there's also kind of established bodies such as UW Medicine and Local Primate Center. These are all places where there's ongoing research and opportunities for students to get involved, both undergraduate and graduate, in basically different areas of work that I'll be talking about today, but then kind of in the neural engineering space at large. So, scoping back into my work, really when I say that I'm working in the engineering space around clinical devices, what I really mean is I'm working with implanted devices that are basically being implanted for a therapeutic purpose to treat some sort of disease or disorder from a patient, and I'm trying to work out how to make these devices a component of a larger system to do basically closed loop work where basically neural sensing and stimulation are being used in conjunction to basically derive some sort of benefit. And my emphasis is on translational studies. So really I'm trying to work in the area of what's going to be relevant in the next 5 to 10 years, where someone in more basic science might be looking at something, understanding the principles of something for like therapeutic benefit in the 10 to 20 year frame. I'm a little bit more closer to term. So I'm trying to use things that are available now in patients to basically try to move take the next step in terms of making some of these therapies more effective. I do this work in 3 different domains. First off, my students and I go into the operating room doing basically neuroscience during deep brain stimulation surgery, and we're increasingly trying to get more active and also tumor resection surgeries as well. We also do work in the epilepsy monitoring unit. So the epilepsy monitoring unit is an environment where patients are implanted with often hundreds of electrodes throughout the brain, basically to try to identify where the brain is causing epileptic seizures, so that then doctors and neurosurgeons can go in and either maybe a lesion in the tissue or determine if a different sort of stimulation device is necessary to basically stop this patient from having their epileptic episodes. And then also then finally in the kind of the chronic implanted neuromodulation devices, where we're implanting devices for 6 months, years, longer term studies where basically we're trying to see how something works very often in the wild. So now, the title of this talk, which I glanced over at the top, really is about the convergence of basically brain-computer interfaces and neuromodulation devices, but really, at some point, let's step back. Neural interfaces. All of us are coming into this talk knowing a little bit about what a neural interface might be, because they are everywhere in pop culture. If you haven't read any of this particular media, there's probably some other sort of media, Black Mirror, like neural interfaces really are, kind of a hallmark of pop culture today. And really kind of, you see it everywhere from books to movies to animated video games. Neural interfaces are not a completely alien concept. Furthermore, we're hearing a lot about neural interfaces in the news, right? There's a lot of hype around different companies which are making new neural interfaces, and it can often be hard to tell what's hype or not. So really, like, starting from the definitions, a neural interface is, there's kind of two fields that are talked about, right? There's neuromodulation, which are things I've made already a lot of reference to in my introduction. These are devices that are being implanted to treat patients today. A lot of the big neuromodulation device that we often talk about is the deep brain stimulator. And these are traditionally just stimulation-only devices. Then there's the brain-computer interface, which is more of a research area where basically patients, maybe often who are locked in or have some sort of injury, are learning how to control a computer cursor on a screen so that they can basically regain some sort of function. And these are traditionally sensing devices. Now, neuromodulation can be delivered across the entire body and the nervous system. You can basically, delivering of stimulation to different parts of the body is used to treat everything from incontinence to pain, depression, and also these Parkinsonian or essential movement disorders in the DBS space. So there's a wide variety of different devices out there that are being used today in clinical practice to basically treat a variety of nervous system disorders that both use non-invasive and invasive stimulation systems. But neuromod is already much more than stimulation, even in established practice today. There's two different systems out there that are FDA approved. There's the NeuroPace RNS system, which senses epileptic activity in the brain and then delivers stimulation to try to stop seizures from happening. And then there's the adaptive DBS space, where looking for biomarkers of Parkinsonian symptoms is used in real time to drive stimulation updates to basically automate what patients would otherwise have to do with their clinician programmer, turning their stimulation up and down as their medication washes in and out. And while I say this is investigational devices and ongoing clinical studies, this is actually a little out of date by several days. Just last week, Medtronic announced that their adaptive deep brain stimulation therapy for Parkinson's disease is actually finally FDA approved. So this is actually out of date just by a couple days on the timestamp. Now, brain-computer interfaces, by contrast, instead of modulating brain activity to make healthy outputs and behavior, uses brain activity to control external devices, right? And so this is a video that anyone in the BCI space has probably seen several dozen times, but it's still, even to this day, despite the timestamp, quite remarkable. That's from 2012, so yes, that's 13 years ago. The interesting thing, of course, is when it comes to modern BCI research, this is still cutting edge. So the BCI field has not necessarily, it's taken them a long time to get much farther. Systems still today look very much like this system in this video. Do I have a mouse? There's the mouse. Where you have a pedestal on the head connected to a grid of electrodes that are penetrating into the cortex to then basically control through monitoring individual neural activity from neurons mapped to moving a robotic arm in some way that the patient can control. And it's remarkable that with training and learning, patients can actually control these devices. There's also been some non-invasive or less invasive demonstrations of brain-computer interfacing work. EEG head caps with electrodes outside the skull have been used to demonstrate BCI. In essence, these systems are much slower, and the bit rate throughput, so to speak, is much lower than an invasive system. And then there's sort of the middle grounds where you have electrodes on the brain directly but not penetrating into it, like ECOG, which are also been widely used in brain-computer interfacing research. But brain-computer interfacing is also much more than sensing, right? So motor tasks require multi-sensory feedback for use. The person, when they're controlling the robot arm, is watching the robot arm and sensing its position through sight, right? So vision, even in this very simple robot, the person controlling the robot arm to feed themselves, there is a closed loop system here where there is sensing by the patient to control this robot. It's anytime that you've sat on your hand or gotten it, it's felt, kind of tingly and you've lost sensation in it, and then try to do something dexterous like flip a coin, you have a hard time doing these things because our brain relies on sensory perception for dexterous control of any sort of simple task like lighting a match or something like that. Doing it while numbed is incredibly difficult. But now, at some point though, there's been a large amount of discussion, not just in pop culture, but also there's been prototype systems out there where we can evoke sensations through stimulation on the brain, such as for having someone sort out different objects through a task where the only thing they can do is to separate these different objects would be different types of neural stimulation delivered to them. So they can classify and understand different sort of neural like stimulation-based textures of an object. And so there's been a long-standing proposal that the inclusion of neural stimulation to sensory cortical areas might be actually a key function that's required to enable someone to do some sort of dexterous control of a robot arm rather than moving their head around a whole lot to make sure that the chocolate lines up just right so they can take their bite out of it. So there's this ongoing convergence within the brain-computer interface and neuromodulation space where, at some point, we've talked about a lot of similar devices that are both sensing from the brain and also delivering stimulation to them. And also, at some point the use cases are very similar. And while today they often seem and are discussed as kind of different fields, as we continue to push forward into the future, where these devices are not just being sensing only or stimulation only, but eventually we're looking at a kind of a future where general purpose or hybrid devices that are both kind of doing brain-computer interfacing control, and then also having neuromodulation effects of the person's brain to basically enable new therapies is really the kind of the future where the field is going. And one kind of question that kind of comes immediately to head though is there's very different regulatory landscapes for these two branches. And while neuromodulation, as kind of defined as deep brain stimulation in RNS systems, there's hundreds of thousands of patients implanted with these devices. This has been on label now for more than 25 years. And we even have the adaptive methods where we have sensing-enabled closed-loop functionality in terms of adaptive ES just now approved. Brain-computer interfaces are actually still kind of in this pseudo-landscape where there's only been like dozens of patients maybe implanted with some of these high-quality brain-computer interface devices. And they're definitely very, very investigational use only, right? And so there's this, in some ways, despite there's this, from a technical and kind of scientific field perspective, there's this convergence of technologies where we're rapidly starting to look at brain-computer interfaces as neuromodulation devices and neuromodulation devices as brain-computer interfaces. In terms of the experience of the people making use of these devices or their application to wider society, there's an asymmetry in that BCI is still very, very early stage and not really near kind of clinical use today. And so one question then is, well, how is neuromodulation continuing to push ahead, right? And in some point, the fact that neuromodulation has a therapeutic application today that has enabled them to basically have devices implanted in hundreds of thousands of patients, we can then start to piggyback off all that clinical familiarity and workflow with research tools and devices to basically continue to push the field forward past the very simple neuromodulation devices that work today, right? So embedding research systems inside of these patients, of these devices has been largely one of the key uses that, despite the fact that the underlying technologies are the same, between the two different fields of BCI and ADBS. Why the neuromodulation space has been, and I'm actually about a slide behind in terms of when I'm pushing forward. These embedding research tools in commercial devices has been a key strategy in how the neuromodulation space has pushed forward towards more adaptive and sensing sophisticated devices. And so, the challenge for this BCI space really is, at some point, what is the minimum viable product for an invasive BCI that can be commercially successful, right? And this is actually a question I do not have the answer to. This will not be presented here today, but that's a longer standing question where at some point something simple enough to basically establish BCI as a therapeutic device needs to be figured out such that then further complexity can then start being added on. And the question really is where is that baseline complexity? Deep brain stimulation neuromodulation had a very simple minimum viable product that was then able to basically make these big inroads in the Parkinsonian and tremor spaces. BCI systems are fundamentally much more complicated and have to basically are thus lagging behind because that complexity makes the translation process much difficult. Now, because the technologies here though are so similar, what's actually we're starting to see though is some of these these neuromodulation, sensing capable neuromodulation devices are actually being leveraged by BCI researchers. So researchers who are interested in doing BCI experiments say, well, why do, I can take this DBS device that has sensing capabilities, I just don't have to stimulate. And now suddenly I have a fully implanted device with chronic use electrodes that I can train a patient to use as a BCI system. And we've actually seen some initial prototypes where people have been trying to do, with some of these deep brain stimulation devices, wheelchair control and other things using a much more limited number of electrodes, but in a chronic, fully implanted space. Now, it also goes both ways in that BCI methods such as identifying movement using cortical signals have been used as trigger sensing for our neuromodulation devices, right? So at some level, this is kind of being used as a way of reinforcing that the algorithmic approaches used in the BCI space have also neuromodulation applications as well. And so as BCI continues to go forward, that will just improve the ability of these therapeutic devices to deliver value in other ways. No, I don't want, there's no, okay, there we go. And it goes both ways, it continues to go both ways where at some point there's going to be BCI devices that are going to be useful in neuromodulation studies, right? So these are supporting BCI, there's already devices like the Cortec Brain Interchange, which is a BCI device, which we're actually here at UW investigating for stroke. But then there's this open question around when we look at Neuralink or other sort of devices on the near term like precision neuroscience, how do we use something like that provides such high resolution as an input sensor into a neuromodulation system to improve treatment of someone with epilepsy is very much an open question. So at some point there's this blurring boundary, between neuromodulation and BCI, and really I guess one of the things that I wanted to bring to this group, given that it's an AI interested group and in terms of how we are looking at information technologies, is really where are the common challenges, and specifically in some of these I'm going to be talking about are ways where machine learning or AI has potential applications in these spaces to basically take these existing devices and move them into some sort of hybrid controller space where both BCI and neuromodulation is being used concurrently. So I'm going to now get into some of the challenges as far as I see it, where I think there's some interesting applications for the sort of topics that you all are interested in. So first off, the challenge one is increasing system complexity. So deep brain stimulation today, if we're just looking at in current clinical practice with the dumb neuromodulation devices, let's call it January 2025, before adaptive DBS was FDA approved. So a very long time ago, several weeks. Basically, surgeons do imaging ahead of time, determine the tract that they're going to basically implant this electrode, and they can get the electrode in, despite the fact that it's in the center of the brain, into the right part of that center of the brain very repeatedly in a really great way. And they do this using basically what's called a stereotactic neurosurgical frame, where they basically have an entire coordinate system and they can basically drop a lead in the right spot. The implanted pulse generator is in the chest, and so there is a tunneling procedure to basically connect the electrodes to the implanted device, and then they're handed off to a neurologist. And the neurologist's job is to look at, okay, where is the lead specifically in this patient after, because it's highly accurate, but there's still variability. But also, let's now try out different stimulation parameters for this individual patient. How does stimulation affect their symptoms? And also, how does this maybe change with different patient states? Like, are they caffeinated? Are they sleep deprived? But also, are there side effects from stimulation, right? Because at some point when you're stimulating deep portions of the brain, you get all sorts of really interesting side effects like eye twitches, paresthesias, difficulty speaking, which is a big problem. And so stimulation side effects versus therapeutic efficacy of this is basically being weighed for each individual parameter set around the different electrodes in order to basically select what works best for this patient. So it's highly manual. So there's this big problem with this space where basically motor symptoms can vary. Therapeutic side effects can really, that trade-off between therapeutic effectiveness and trade-off can result in lower efficacy because you can't do the stimulation you want because it has too much bad side effects. And furthermore, these are devices with batteries in them, right? Draining the battery in a non-rechargeable device means that the patient's going back for surgery. In a rechargeable device, it means that maybe the device is having to be recharged by the patient sitting around with a little sling doing wireless power transfer, like our little coasters that we have for our cell phones, but now placed on the chest. Maybe they have to do that once a day as opposed to once a week, right? So there's real burdens associated with unnecessary stimulation. So the underlying hypothesis of the neuromodulation space is, hey, we can use brain signals to determine when and how stimulation is needed, so we only deliver stimulation at the time it's needed, so maybe then patients will be willing to accept some side effect when they really, really need it. We won't be draining the batteries all that much. And also, we can maybe adjust and deliver more stimulation as maybe their motor symptoms get worse. So this is the adaptive side of adaptive DBS. And there's been some really exciting work out there. The algorithm that the Medtronic just got approved basically uses signals at the same site of stimulation in the subthalamic nucleus. It's a very simple algorithm in that basically the beta band of activity, which is a frequency range in kind of the 13 to 35 hertz, the power in that band in the subthalamic nucleus corresponds with symptom intensity where it goes up as symptoms are worse, and as patients take medications or stimulations turned on, it goes down. And so it's a very simple way of like just using this as almost a thermostat, where if beta's too high, you need to turn up you need to turn on the heater, you need to give it some more juice, some more stimulation. If stimulation gets too low, if beta gets too low, we're probably overstimulating, so we can relax a little bit. And so this is where basically this is an example of a very simple algorithm, which is also effective in terms of providing a way for the device to balance stimulation with as medication washes in and out. Now, this is the trial, and basically the ongoing trial by Medtronic shows it has basically with the FDA approval has shown that this actually works and provides better actually a benefit than off the shelf. The trick is though, is to do this closed loop parameter space, you suddenly now have a device which has to do sensing, processing, classification, and have a dynamic state table based on all that defines all the actions it takes in every single different neural sensing scenario. Before, a neurologist was there just trying out, for this contact, let's do amplitude, pulse width, and frequency changes, and let's try a different one. How the heck is that neurologist going to configure this table? I'll tell you, they can't. They need a PhD to do it, right? And this has 10 times as many parameters. Even if they did have a PhD, to exhaustively search and figure out the right thing for the right patient is going to take too long. And so there's a system complexity is a serious translational barrier to anybody working in this space. And really at some point, like if you start thinking about system complexity as an axis, in really this is a useful exercise for more than just neuromodulation and BCI, but this then starts to explain why BCI has had such a hard time translating beyond dozens of patients. DPS on label is simple enough where a single clinician in a couple hour sessions once every couple months can actually figure this out to work for a single device. Some of the RNS devices like the NeuroPace RNS is a triggered stimulation system for epilepsy, a little bit more complicated because that was actually doing some neural sensing. But it's still, the algorithm is simple enough that the company can help out. Adaptive DBS in the general investigational sense, now at some point, we don't know exactly what algorithms Medtronic did to basically bring this, or exactly actually, we haven't seen it in practice yet despite their FDA approval, at where this fits on this axis of can it fit into a clinical workflow yet. But in the traditional sense, in the ADBS field for the last dozen years or so, research teams are kind of you have to have an entire research team to manage 10 to 12 patients. So, at some point this has been an area where it's been doable to push the field forward, but hasn't necessarily been clear how we'll fit this into a kind of a longer term clinical system. BCI though is all the way over here where we have research teams dedicated to just getting a single patient working, right? And so at some level, what we need here clearly is automated tools, machine learning driven approaches where we can basically have the system work in a way to collect data from these patients such that we can then automatically optimize the device for an individual patient, right? And so we have some demonstrations with this where basically using some very simple, for linear regression models have been able to be used using an external system. In other ways, trying to create a surface, kind of like a three-dimensional surface of stimulation response and cost functions based on the trade-off between stimulation and side effects have also been used. And basically, really for future use here, we're going to need using real-world data. We need a lot of real-world data from these patients in order to figure out how we can basically model the patient's response to stimulation and then predict either through a transfer learning process or maybe just optimizing the patient individually over a period of time, how we can then figure out what all these parameters should be for it to be effective, right? And that's actually the need to collect this real world data actually then gets into the next challenge, which is getting out of the clinic in the lab. And at some point, most of the adaptive DBS studies have really been, you bring the patient to the lab, you connect them up to the system, you then run an algorithm while they maybe are performing some tasks, and then, and you're trying to capture maybe they take medication at some point to see like what happens in that case. And there's this underlying question that even if you show that results work well there, do these results translate to real life benefit, when it's not in this controlled setting? And so there's this real serious need for remote data collection is needed to verify the performance of these systems in day-to-day life, so that basically you can prove that this system is actually going to be helpful for the patient. But also, to the last point, you need all this data of the neural and wearables and the current device settings in order to basically do any sort of modeling of how the patient actually is interacting with the therapy so that you can then optimize the device's parameters for their use. And at some level, the COVID-19 pandemic really accelerated the expansion of remote healthcare and clinical research. So this is, just within the last few years, there's been a large effort to start pushing this stuff out of the clinic and sending patients home with the data collection systems. There's been some work that I've collaborated on with a team at UCSF, Phil Starr, Simon Little, on basically putting patients out there and collecting data. And in some ways, we actually went above and beyond what I just showed in that figure. We also instrumented their home. We put cameras in a patient's home to basically monitor in real time, not just from the wearable sensors, but how were they interacting with their computer? We could have them do movement-related tasks that we could use for clinical assessment in a remote context and have that be something they did on a day-to-day basis while we optimize the algorithms by changing up what the stimulation devices onboard processing should be. And while all the while collecting data from all these different sensing electrodes. And that ends up actually creating some pretty interesting results where you can, from the patient's home, we suddenly know this is a skeleton output from open pose. And so we have the patient doing a finger tapping task, and when they're not well treated, Parkinson's patients start to slow down and the amount that they can open it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. This patient's actually doing pretty good, again, because the algorithm's doing pretty good. But we have now neural data time synced up to behavioral data in a way that, we would get in a clinical environment if the patient was actually in the clinic. But now that we have him, he's doing this at home on a day-to-day basis. And so this is like, at some point, any sort of machine learning process requires vast heaps of data, either on individuals or at a population scale. We can start to actually consider how we would collect that data using basically at-home monitoring systems that basically patients are willing to accept. But the question is, at some point, what are they willing to accept, right? And so while this patient was willing to sign up for this, this is an investigational study, would all patients sign up for video cameras in their home, accessible, recording 24/7 by a research team? Probably not. But that's a question for another day. Now, kind of pushing this piece even forward, what's also been explored is trying to have computational systems follow the patient around. So it's not just data collection, it's actually cloud-based pipelines that are then informing almost in an edge computing like manner, a smart tablet that the patient's carrying around with them that then is in communication with the device to do activities like seizure forecasting. Now, basically, when you have computation that's too hard to do on the device because it's too intense, it requires too many cycles to do, you could, at some point, people have started investigating, sending out an actual tablet out there to do more intensive data processing. The key problem, of course, is if this tablet then shuts down or is dropped or whatever, suddenly that patient's therapy looks very, very different, right? And so there's a big kind of concern at some point that while a lot of the kind of PC in the loop stuff works in a research ecosystem, these aren't necessarily translatable to clinical widespread use either. So the final moment to do is also, as you keep on adding on these devices to collect more data to power your machine learning methods, at some point you're asking more and more of the patient, right? This picture over here has 6 devices that the patient has to keep recharged just to participate in the study. There's an Apple Watch. Actually, here's the funny thing. There was actually 7 because they had 2 Apple Watches. But there's not, we didn't do the left hand in the picture, so I say there's 6 in this picture. But we're ignoring the fact that on their other hand, they also had an Apple Watch as well. Each of these devices has a battery. And at some point, it becomes a scheduling nightmare to figure out when and how long does each device last before I have to recharge it. These patients are incredibly patient that work with us, but clearly as things move forward in the clinical space for both BCI and neuromodulation, as we demand more data from individuals who are working with these systems, we need to consolidate how we're collecting that data into a manageable amount of devices that can basically produce it. Yeah, and compliance is a big problem, of course, just when you're scheduling on this thing. And Parkinson's patients are pretty cognitively aware, right? We're also working with neuropsych patients who have motivational problems if the therapy's not necessarily working out well, right? So compliance for a depressed patient, what the needs are is going to be very, very different in terms of managing patients who are working, have Parkinson's or tremor. And that actually gets into the next point, neuropsychiatric applications. Movement disorders, it's very easy to sense symptoms, right? I can put a armband, I can put a wrist on a wristwatch, and I can sense tremor or movement or other things like that. Wearables are very easy at sensing movement disorders. One of the hard problems, though, is when we're looking at neuropsychiatric behavior, where people are depressed or obsessive compulsive, how do we take wearable data and extract more than are you tremoring or not, but instead look at how well are you in terms of your mood and energy, and how are we able to distill much more nuanced evaluations of patients' wellness that don't necessarily just simply aren't just simply like, is their limb moving all over the place or not. And so there's a lot of data out there to suggest that wearables can be used to correlate different symptoms, but really the thing is, in a long-term monitoring context for a neuropsychiatric study, there's a lot of work to do in terms of modeling and understanding, using the data we're collecting to basically extract correlates of patient wellness. That's not just simply movement related, right? And this is a fundamental, machine learning classification problem that will need to be solved at some point. And where the reason why this is really important is in the neuropsychiatric space. We're actually running a study in conjunction with Baylor, where basically we're working on DBS for bipolar depressive patients. And bipolar patients already basically naturally kind of oscillate between these depressed states where they're really, they have really low energy and they really don't want to do anything and they're really sad, to manic states where they're really high energy, top of the world, and want to get out there and do all this stuff. Well, there's risks associated with perhaps interfering with this disorder through the use of stimulation, where what happens if you make someone really sad but have high energy? So they're really going out there and doing things when they're sad. That could be potentially dangerous, right? And so at some point in the neuropsychiatric space, there's a different risk profile that patient monitoring might be needed to fill in. And this, where the data, we're actually being able to use this classification system to extract patient well-being might actually be a prerequisite for a future therapy in this space, because if you need to identify when someone is entering in a mixed state, which has a higher probability of suicide ideation because they're sad, and potentially a higher rate of actually trying to take action on those things because they have energy to do so, basically ends up being potentially something that we need a kind of an engineering system needs to pay attention to. And so this is where, at some point, like I mentioned, we have this clinical trial, and we're trying to take all this data we're collecting and then extract what are the features that basically will correlate with the patient wellness in these different areas while undergoing a neuromodulation therapy to hopefully make people more well. So this is an area also as well. And one key part of that is trying to establish how do we track these patients, this system, create a system where we can use this to inform clinicians, because the first line of defense in any of these areas is the clinician who has to act on it. So you have to have some sort of system where we can extract things like, this is basically a sleep breakdown based on an aura ring, and we send a report every day based on what's the sleep that the patient was basically is having, and do we think that's indicative of maybe a depressive or a manic episode, trying to anticipate how can we, and then as the study progresses, using the new data that we're going to be collecting from these patients to basically model how we can track patient wellness throughout this study. And this is in the service of creating machine learning driven behavioral models, really, right? And that will be have clinically relevant outcomes. Now, I'm actually going to skip over the next section because it talks about stimulation artifacts, which is just a long-standing irritation of me, but perhaps, I guess we have time, so I could talk about stimulation artifacts. At some point, now this is now a bit of a pivot. We've been talking about neuropsych, we talked about movement disorders, now we're talking about stroke. So inducing neuroplasticity has been proposed as a way of enhancing basically someone getting better rehab. So if we can, through the use of basically stimulation, and we can perhaps enhance the connectivity between different areas so that when someone's receiving rehab from an OT or PT, that basically they maybe learn how to use their hand better, right? We're hoping here to basically enhance the brain's capacity to reconsolidate and relearn how to drive its motor system after a stroke has inhibited that. And in this study, we're implanting this a device, the cortex brain interchange, basically on top of the cortical surface above the stroke. So we're focusing specifically on patients where the cortex is intact, but basically the pathways down and out to actual motor, the muscles are inhibited. Now, one thing that we always do in the engineering sense when we're building a closed loop system like that is we often characterize the device in saline, where we can perhaps play neural signals in to a tank and then confirm that the device is basically delivering stimulation at the right times that it needs to, right? And at and we can actually do that, right? And so at some point we have a signal coming in, and then we have the signal, and we're delivering stimulation. In this paradigm, we're trying to hit troughs of beta activity. There's basically some preliminary work that if you deliver stimulation timed with beta troughs, that actually enhances the brain's capacity to it enhances the connectivity between different regions of the brain. I'm not going to get into the neuroscience of it, but at one level, I want to show you what this, while we're hitting the right portions of the beta band, what I want to show you is what this looks like in the raw form, where we have neural signal, and then every single time we stimulate, we come out with we have these giant disturbances in the neural data. And so what we're having to do is we're having to spend a large portion of our effort processing this data just simply to extract and pull out this relatively terrible simulation artifact, which actually isn't necessarily even working all that well. So at some level, when it comes to taking data and removing simulation artifacts, there's a lot of work to do, not only in the circuit domain, but also in the data processing way, which could perhaps be driven by better machine learning tools in some of these areas to basically recapitulate what the data would have been without the stimulation artifact, clearly. And this is where I'm actually going to kind of skip along because we have a limited amount of time left. But needless to say, there's a lot of, oh my goodness, I can't believe I did so many little breakout things. Basically, the key thing here is that we need a lot of help still on the simulation artifact side, which is a combination of hardware and advanced signal processing, and perhaps applying methods such as machine learning driven methods to basically kind of clean up the data by knowing, and this is where there's a lot of interesting methods in terms of, you can use a variety of methods either to identify what's irregular or perhaps identify what a stimulation artifact is, and then try to basically have an estimate of what the underlying signal was. There's a variety of different tools I think that can be used in that space. And finally, I want to talk about research tools in the more general sense. And this is, again, another one that's a little bit less AI driven, but still a kind of an important thing to chew on, which is, I talked a little bit about this tablet that was being used as a way of controlling the device with a more sophisticated computational model on it than the device itself can support, right? And why is that tablet there? Well, the answer is the device wasn't designed to support the algorithm, right? And at some point, a lot of these devices, when we're embedding these, kind of signal processing chains and firmware from a technical perspective, you can't really go back very easily and just change up what the system does, right? At some point, what if we didn't want to do a Fourier transform? What if we wanted to do a wavelet? What if we wanted a different type of classifier? Like, at some point, once you ship the device out as they currently existed as, kind of microcontroller with very dedicated firmware on it, how, that's very set up in specific ways, it's not necessarily, it ends up being very restrictive for the much more open-ended research space. And so there's this underlying design challenge, right? How do we make these implanted systems more flexible? How do we embed, capacity to do like customized neural networks, neuromorphic processing? Or how do we have systems where maybe there's an operating system, maybe there's more complicated compute available where maybe we can do some sort of application programming that would run on the device, and maybe that application would be in, running in a little operating system. Like there's applications out there which, and kind of examples in terms of like how people program Raspberry Pis and different things like that, where there might be opportunities to figure out ways to re-architect the devices themselves to support more general purpose research-driven compute, and maybe then start to embed more interesting machine learning or AI-driven models basically working with these devices. But that's still very much up in the air. The key thing why this really matters, though, is that there's a lot of very exciting results out there, including a very early study actually from 2013 looking at beta bursting stimulation, which is a method I haven't talked about so far, but which actually had extremely good positive results in a Parkinson's trial. And the problem is that there hasn't been a fully implemented research tool that supports this sort of algorithm. So there's algorithms out there that have been piloted in patients using externalized hardware that we haven't been able to test in a fully implemented context. We keep on seeing machine learning driven biomarker identification methods and basically computational modeling approaches of how to do stimulation, which are all really sophisticated, but until there's something a way that they can run on a device, it's not going to make its way into a patient. And so this is where at some point there is the question of, well, how do you simplify your take your machine learning outputs, determine a new algorithm that can run on an existing device. We've already seen some examples of that so far, but then there's also the question of, well, how can we make these devices something more capable of running more sophisticated algorithms as well? And that's the other side of the coin, more for the electrical engineers in the group and system designers in the group, kind of in the longer term. And at some point, this will feed into the needs for really kind of future research tools. There's kind of at some point right now, there's a lack of kind of deep brain stimulation focused adaptive research tools. The two that I've talked about some Activo PC++ work here and some Summit RC++ work. Those devices have both been sunsetted. They don't exist anymore. There's a Medtronic Percept device, which is the device that now has clinical adaptive functionality and sensing functionality, but it doesn't necessarily, it's very limited use for research. It doesn't really have a lot of the openings of what we would necessarily have used in some of those previous systems to basically do closed loop research. And then there's a couple other devices kind of that are very either restrictive use. So at some point, I started out this presentation much earlier talking about how in the neuromodulation space, things have been pushed forward in large part by the capacity to embed research tools and use investigational devices. In a lot of ways right now, there isn't a whole lot of devices around. And so there's kind of a question around how will we be building these devices in the future and kind of establishing the next generations of therapies, which I think there's a lot of opportunities for as well. So wrapping up, I know we covered a lot of topics. We covered BCI and neuromodulation, both from the high level, from the definition level, and then talking about this convergence that's been going on, basically through the common technological frameworks of both systems having to do neural sense and STIM and running into the same sort of questions. At some point, we talked about a variety of clinical challenges here, many of which I think are really kind of specific to and addressable through enhanced data, machine learning, and AI methods. And really, at some point, I think BCI neuromodulation fields and devices are going to kind of continue to see similar translational challenges, and that a lot of collaboration between groups working across these domains will really be important of pushing things forward. So with that, I work with a lot of people. One of the things I love about the neuromodulation and really the neural engineering space is it requires people from a wide variety of backgrounds, because basically you can approach this space from almost any angle because it's such a multidisciplinary effort. It needs people with computational backgrounds, it needs people with engineering backgrounds, nurses, neurosurgeons, psychiatrists, ethicists. I can go on and on and on about the different ways that people can interact in this space and are actually needed in these sorts of studies. And so that's something I just really like, but that means it's very much a team science-based approach. And variety of funding has gone into all this stuff. Happy to take questions.
I have some questions written down, but if anyone else has questions that they would like to ask, please go ahead.
How much time do we have?
We have 15 minutes.
Okay. I did one question. So, has there been work into like specifically like there's a subfield of computer science like active learning, so like active learning algorithms kind of like dealing with I think in math stuff like bandit problems and stuff like that. I was interested because they seem to be more general purpose. Like it basically, if there's a device with knobs to tune essentially, and there's an algorithm that could tune those knobs in like an intelligent way, would that be flexible enough while not needing like a whole operating system to run on things? That'd be like the most flexible, right? But it would probably be a little more of an engineering task. Has there been work into like somewhere in the middle? It's like
yeah, there's been some work. I'm not sure if they would classify in the active learning space, but at some point, one of the things you need is you need an objective function that basically defines what it's being optimized for, right? In some way, you need something that it can measure the output effectiveness of what it's doing, right? And in some cases, I think there's some really good candidates out there. The Apple Watch, for example, has a health kit which has tremor scores and dyskinesia scores that basically can feed into a system. At some level, what's lacking right now on the kind of the tooling side is a way to, I would suppose, like build out one thing that hasn't really been done yet is the connecting of the cloud connection of these measures in a way that would be fully automated to then like go back and update the different parameters. The tools have been there. A lot of the times though, in practice, and I think specifically to the UCSF study, where they did have the Apple Watches, right? So they had tremor and dyskinesia scores. A lot of times the algorithms that were being tuned were less focused on it being a completely data-driven approach, in large part because there was like specific hypotheses being tested. I don't think there's been many efforts to do kind of a much more like hands-off, like let's see what it does with this algorithm, because in some ways it's like there's almost so many knobs to turn. And that would be kind of a question I have back, would be it's like when there's 100 knobs with the different parameters to do it in, like it's almost, and you have basically a couple scores you're getting back about how effective it is. You'd almost need to have like a system doing like 24/7 probing, and how long does it have to be doing that sort of thing to get them all in the right spot?
Yeah, that's the thing. The ML analogy I could think of would be like hyperparameter tuning in a sense, but that like requires a lot of GPU power. But there's like, I know there's techniques to essentially, if you have some like search space of parameters, intelligently kind of search that, not like grid search or anything like that, but like kind of, I try out this combination, knowing some facts about these parameters, I think this combination would work better. I think there's like a Bayesian sweep is like the most basic.
Yeah, I think in some ways one of the problems is the parameter space. You'd have to like pick out which parameter, you'd have to like narrow the field in some ways and have it work in kind of a more constrained fashion. I think there's opportunities for work like that. I haven't necessarily, I've seen different types of work done completely in silica, like simulations of doing that sort of work. And I think there's been a variety of people that have shown that it's feasible. I haven't seen anyone yet take that to the next step of then running it with a patient.
Kind of a similar but separate question is like, a lot of the stuff you're talking about, like the challenges with the devices not basically being what's necessary to put these like, fun algorithms on. It seems to be because there's like the surgical barrier. Is there too much measurement noise when you have like an external device at this point, if that makes sense? Like why, of course, like implanting a device would give you like better, resolution with your like data that you're collecting, but is it not possible to like develop like external devices which would then easily be like, you could take it off and like change it a bit, you don't have to like surgically re-implant something?
So at some level, there has been some work done in terms of trying to identify non-invasive ways of doing DBS like stimulation that rely on either like low intensive ultrasound or like kind of different methods of doing. The hard part is the stimulation at this point is still very much needs to be local with an electrode surgically implanted. So that's where at some point all the other non-invasive ways of doing DBS are purely in the realm kind of theory, or have maybe been piloted on some animals, but not on a human scale brain, to my knowledge. And there's some question, but there have been some pilots done, I think, in some people. But so largely though, the neuromodulation space basically is still relying and focused on, there's an implanted stimulation lead, right? So once you have an implanted stimulation lead, you have to then, if you're going to basically have a device somewhere that's then driving that lead, and then you have some external wearable system that's controlling it, that has been like piloted, and there's a lot of questions there that start to come up. What happens, like the tablet in the Mayo case, right, where there's an external computation unit. That computation unit could be connected to some external leads and electrodes or something like that, right? There's still this question of communication to and from the device itself is very battery intensive. Two, wearing a cap or something like that is something patients don't want to do all the time, right? There's like an acceptance issue. Having something like a watch or a wearable or something like that is more acceptable to patients. And then B, what happens when that device like powers down? You need to establish safe fallbacks for the device when it can't find anyone to communicate, right? When the Wi-Fi is down effectively, right? So at some point, like, that's where a lot of the focus has been in terms of establishing like some device that would be translatable in this space, trying to figure out all-in-ones such that it's one device that doesn't have to rely on a network communication to either wearable sensors or something like that, just because it then ends up being something that's more robust. So it's a robustness issue, really.
Last thing, sorry.
You're totally fine.
It's just like, nowadays we have computers that are like tiny but incredibly powerful, right? I'm just curious, like, it seems very possible if they're able to implant these, like, you know, it seems like in the hardware there's like a Fourier transform and like some classifiers and like a state table, but I've seen like tiny computers, right? So what I'm saying is, if we can have a computer like proper, like able to run like more complex software at that scale, these devices seem, you know, sizable, like palm sized, maybe. I don't know. I couldn't really tell the scale.
They are palm sized.
Okay. But like, it's I could
maybe
imagine,
not palm size. My palm's pretty big, but they're at some point, you know, bigger than a silver dollar. Certainly.
Yeah. Okay. Like, I've seen computers that are like mesh small. I'm just curious, like, why is it just kind of like a administrative holdover, like, or like regulatory thing, like, oh, we have these computers, but we just can't put them in the body yet because we need to go through so many clinical
At
trials.
some point, there is always like whenever you go to smaller processed silicon, you are more likely to have different errors or probably like, you know, the testing becomes more complicated. So at some point, there is a certain amount of inertia that is required, and, you know, activation energy that's required to get the medical device industry to scale anything up to the next, like almost a next generation of hardware components, right? Because every single time you swap out to a different microcontroller, you then have to almost consider your testing frameworks from scratch. You have to so the medical device industry does end up reusing old stuff for very long periods of time, and there are periods where things are refreshed. And one question I do have is, and often still a lot of those refreshes though, it's looking at the most robust technology that could maybe exist, basically work, something that works in a patient for maybe 9 years, right? And thinking about it from that perspective, like how long, if the processor, the device has basically it's a rechargeable device, and it, you know, has a 9-year lifespan, what do you need to do to, like, from a hardware perspective, to basically make sure that it actually lasts that long without failure or without, you know, accumulating too many RAM errors or SRAM problems? You know, at some point, like, that's where they are slow. But no, to your point, I do think there's a lot of applications perhaps of, and really what is needed is justification. If you come up with the right justification, like, no, this is the technology we need in order to make the device that we need for this application, that's often what drives the medical device manufacturers then to take the next step to like a higher order. You need a reason to force them to do it, and that's, in some part, it's a chicken and egg problem, right? Because we don't know what's needed, what we can do with like a higher power computer, compute in there, but without knowing what we can do with the higher power, they don't want to put it in there. And so it does end up being a little bit of so instead it ends up being much more incremental, at some level.
So you have to prove that like the algorithm that you have is like worth all this extra effort on the hardware.
Yeah, and proving it in like a percutaneous, i.e. like externalized lead situation, it's like you're not showing how that works in a chronic sense, right? So it's often sometimes hard to kind of really demonstrate. It's one of the challenges of working in the area is that oftentimes the technology really is generations behind.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
So I remember earlier we had that GIF or image or whatever of that woman who had I think the electrode implanted.
Yep.
And
the robot arm
yeah, the robot
feeding yourself
arm.
chocolate.
And then you talk about a sensory information and how it's dependent on if your eyes are open, and based off those signals, you have the stimulations. So, is there any way that if you have your eyes closed, but you have some sort of maybe you have like this huge data set or table where you have like mapped the signals to stimulation, so that even when your eyes are closed, you can theoretically do the certain movements.
So at some point, the point I would make actually I was trying to make, I think, with the sensory feedback, is that when you're dexterously doing stuff, right, you can do them still when things are closed, right? I can come over here and I'm pretty sure there's a desk here, right? What am I doing? I'm feeling around for it, right? But also, even when I'm grabbing something and moving something around, I know where my hand is in space.
Yeah.
I know where my hand is in space because there's stretch receptors in every single muscle through this body that basically, so everything you do has huge amounts of sensory information that we receive in order to basically accomplish basic tasks, right? And these kind of like output only systems like the robot arm, which are only being piloted based purely on visual feedback, kind of in the existing frameworks that that video showed. Basically, one of the long-standing hypotheses is if we add more sensory feedback from that robot arm, maybe if there's like a stretch receptor or like a force receptor, if there's something in the robot, like the tension joints or the kind of the weight of the arm in different ways, or pressures sensors along the arm from an artificial skin, if we can incorporate more information from these robot arms and deliver them in a way that the brain can then interpret, more similar to like the way we actually use our real arms, perhaps we can get further along than this janky robot jerky motion that where she struggled to feed herself. She succeeded in feeding herself chocolate, which is exciting. It was not a natural movement. It was not easy for her, right? And one of the thoughts is that, hey, if we enable more sophisticated sensory feedback, perhaps then this could actually become something that would be more natural to someone who's paralyzed like that.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes. I have another question. It's not exactly super topical to everything that you're talking about. So I was just wondering what you think about it. And basically, you know how you have dreams, right?
Yeah.
And in dreams, you're not having any sensory information with your hands because you're asleep. You're not moving your hands everywhere. You're not running around. But in the dream, you could be. Now, is there a way to neurologically have, for example, you have your eyes closed, but then you have simulations in some sort of way to place some sort of kind of like a dream, like an image in your head? Is that possible?
Hey, I think, are you guys here at 5? Or?
Yeah, are you just finishing?
Yeah, we're
Yes,
just
we're
finishing
just
up.
finishing up, yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Play stimulation to as just an input.
Yeah, to create for example, an image in your mind, kind of like that dream.
Yeah. So at some level, you can, or some of the sensory stimulation work that we've done, we deliver sensory stimulation, and the person doesn't have to be doing something in a task, and they report feeling it, right? So if someone was dreaming or awake, one could anticipate that if you were doing some sensory stimulation that would evoke a percept, like a sensation of being touched, to deliver that during a dream, they might feel like they were touching something in that dream. I think that would be reasonable. Yeah, so now when it comes to inducing sight, there's work going on around visual prostheses. Some of them do stimulation, and they create little grids of phosphenes or what they're called of light, and it ends up being, they're pretty rudimentary at this point, because just think about it, it's a 16-bit, it's not a 16, it's not a 16-bit resolution, it's like a 4-bit resolution. right? So like they're and it's on and off, right? There's no color. So, but like in theory, like extrapolating that up, could you try to do some visual playback into someone's brain? I think there's, you know, maybe while their eyes were closed or they were dreaming, potentially feasible given some of the different things like that. You might be able to do, you know, kind of do something like that. But I think it's very, very far away at this point in terms of just getting the right amount of resolution.
Okay.